All right. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is creating a program of research and where to start. And like, what does that even mean, especially when you are a postbac or an undergrad or at the beginning stages of your graduate career? Um, and it's one of these like funky things that everyone talks about is like programmatic research, and I think especially in the early stages as you're like gaining experience, uh, my biggest takeaway over time is one, yes, being thoughtful in what projects you choose to do and what labs you're joining, but two, also just like how can we make this a cohesive story that we can tell over and over and over again is really like the sprinkled magic of those pieces. But generally today, what our agenda is going to be. Am I still sharing my screen? You can see it. Okay, cool. Sorry, I realized I didn't check. First, we're going to just even define what programmatic research means, and then we're going to go through steps to identifying broad topics of interest, finding and reading literature. I feel like that's something that everyone tells you to do, but nobody necessarily tells you how to do it. So I'm going to just go over a couple different things about how to do that systematically. And then walking into developing research ideas, asking specific research questions, and developing research products, which are really important for admission into graduate education. And then at the end, the panelists are all going to sort of take a couple moments to talk through what their program development journeys were. So how they created their programmatic research, if you will. Yeah. And feel free to ask questions as we go along. I'll also leave some time at the end. And then for those of you that weren't on earlier, what I was saying was that if there's any questions or reflections that you'd rather not be a part of the recording or a recording in general, I can pause that and restart it after we have that conversation. Okay. So programmatic research is this idea that you have an overarching research theme that focuses on a key issue, problem, phenomena, outcome. And you're basically asking yourself, what is this sort of broad process that you're trying to understand? And how can you pick projects that answer small parts of that broad problem or that broad process? And sometimes what it feels like you have to do, especially when you're writing personal statements as an undergrad, or even writing fellowship statements beginning in your first couple years in graduate school, is really finding what those common threads from research project to research project are, and using those threads to really narrow in on what interests you and what sort of you want to follow through on and continue to research as you develop into that career space. Something that I had gotten advice to do early on, and found as a really interesting approach, was to essentially graph out the relationships. And so I have a little bit of a picture of that at the end when I talk through my program of research. But generally, like, what was this paper you did? What was this project you worked on? What was this term paper you wrote in this class, and what about them make you excited, and how are they connected? And I'm definitely a visual person, so I think like infographics or like getting out a whiteboard and drawing those out was really helpful to me in that process. Another thing to think about is as you get further along in your career, there is this semi-expectation that your overarching research program is more systematic over time, and that you can use and really identify your series of research projects that are building upon each other to answer specific questions. Finally, the thing that when I started grad school as someone in a first generation background, I was shocked by is how often I had to give an elevator speech about who I was and what I like to do, and what like 2 sentences of my research interests were and what they were. And I would say in the first year, how I gave that elevator speech varied like class to class in a single day, let alone like day to day, let alone week to week. Like, it is crazily evolved in thinking through how to talk about those pieces. And even as silly as it sounds, as you're entering these spaces, sometimes it's helpful just to like partner up with a buddy or a cohort mate or somebody else that you know that's in a similar space, and like give it a try and practice it. And, it's okay to stick with one. I feel like I just was floundering a little bit. And like for some reason was constantly surprised that people kept asking me to like give them my like 2-minute elevator speech. And so, and the reason I say that is because I think that all sort of fits into this overarching theme and like what you want your broad research area to be. So I really liked this general idea and funnel where you sort of have this broad topic. When you're thinking about your research program, then you sort of go into some preliminary reading and figuring out what's out there in the literature. And then you sort of keep narrowing down to find a specific niche of the field that has less stuff and less research in it, or there's a new nuanced way to really think about or look at those pieces. And then finally getting into a very practical, answerable research question that's focused on a very single specific part of a problem, is researchable, is feasible to do at your career level, and is like concurrently relevant, because you often have to make the argument that these questions matter for some purpose or for some larger purpose. Also, I'll just say if any panelists have anything to add, feel free to jump in at any point too. Okay, so the dreaded question, what are you interested in? In figuring this out, I think it's a fun exercise to really, you don't have to do it now, but like taking a moment of time to think about what is the broadest category of research that you're interested in. Like psychology is what I listed there, or like the intersection between psychology and biology, or the intersection between psychology and like social health, for example. So think really, really broad, and then how much can you like narrow that down? So like for me, I think about psychology, and then I knew I was interested in development, and then I knew I was interested in like the subsect of social and emotional development, and then in particular the role that parenting played in social and emotional development. So I'm like narrowing down, and to be fair, this gets narrowed even more with regards to parenting, of like parenting in low SES contexts, and then positive parenting in those contexts, and what contributes to that positive parenting that then like goes all the way back up this arrow threshold. As you're trying to figure out what you're interested in, I also think it's really, really helpful to just do informational interviews with faculty or staff or graduate students about what they're doing and what they're passionate about and why. And then even if you're still not sure, I think it's always a good idea to like try something out and get involved in a project or get involved in a lab to see if you like it or don't like it, or what parts of it you enjoy or don't enjoy over time. It's okay to like try multiple things, I guess is basically what I'm saying, as you're trying to figure out this delineation. So the other piece, I'm not going to walk through all of these questions, but I thought that these were really helpful things to be asking yourself over time about what you're interested in order to really think about what your overarching theme and maybe even what those specific questions might be. So like, again, what subjects covered in the field are you most interested in, all the way down to what skills do you want to develop, right? So like sometimes when you're an undergrad or a post-bac, having skills in say neuroimaging is really important for some fields. And so like finding labs that give you the chance to study or gain skills in that space, even if it's not exactly what you want to be studying in graduate school, is still like potentially a really good area to dive into. And so just making sure you're being really thoughtful about those pieces. And even if you're not, like, even if you feel like there aren't a lot of options for you, or you can't like, or you are sort of taking opportunities where they come up, really thinking about what skills have you gained from these experiences that are applicable to what you have a passion for too. Because I guarantee you that there are translatable things across most of these pieces. Okay, that was super, super broad. Any initial questions before I dive a little bit into like finding and reading research articles thoughtfully? Give it a 1 or 2 Mississippi. Okay, so one of my biggest pet peeves in graduate school as well as in undergrad classes is how often students aren't really taught about how to like look for and how to read empirical articles. And when I started graduate school, they throw at you like 6 hours of reading in a week for your first It's probably more than that. I don't know. Like it's like so much reading. It's like hundreds of pages in a week of reading. And it was taking me literally forever. And I was so confused why some of my classmates were able to figure it out a little bit more simply than I was. And it, I don't know. I think it just like took me a long time to learn that on my own. Um, yeah. Okay. But so I try to make it a point for people that I'm working with, and I'm telling them to go find and read articles to like sort of talk about what I mean. And so again, I'm not going to try to go through these in any like big detail, but I just wanted to have them here in case anyone wants to go back and look at them or like pull up the PowerPoint that will be in the same location as the recording. And so I'll be sure to send that out. But again, most people are using Google Scholar to find articles, and that you can search specifically through whatever university system you're affiliated with for easy access to all PDFs. And if you are looking for sort of relevant work or looking for sort of, I guess, niches or cutting edges of development to think about your programmatic research, looking within like the last 5 to 10 years is really helpful so that you sort of have the most up-to-date, innovative methods and sort of what the cutting edge of that field is. And then finally, if you find a study that you like loved, one of the biggest tricks that I love about Google Scholar is that you can click this cited by piece and find all the articles that cited that article that you loved to get more about that and more about that sort of subsection, and read more about it to think like dive more deeply into that subject matter. My other note is that I highly recommend using a citation management system, and I link a website that talks about those. It's really, really helpful as you're sort of parsing through a bunch of articles for whatever purpose you're parsing through those articles for. My other tip here is that when you have like papers and things in undergrad classes where you have to write like term papers, try to pick subject matter that you find really interesting that might be helpful in serving to give you a purpose for diving into this research and like critically analyze it. I think that helps a lot of people narrow in as well. Okay, so these are just some tips about advanced searching and key terms. And so then I wanted to dive in a little bit into how to read empirical articles. And so I think this was the main reason that I always like took forever to read, was because you're not supposed to read empirical articles linearly. You have to think about what the purpose of reading that empirical article is. And then before you commit to reading it fully, thinking about how are you skimming through those various pieces to get what you need out of it before going back and doing a more in-depth read. And so, you know, on the next page, I have a couple links and stuff about like this process, but generally, the question I always ask myself first is like, what am I looking for when I'm reading through articles? And so if it's for an idea for research, you want to look at these original research articles, randomized controlled trials, experimental studies, cohort studies, case control studies, etc. If you're looking for a topic overview or updates, you're looking for things that are more narrative or systematic or meta-analysis. So, you know, depending on what stage you're at in this programmatic development stage, maybe you start off with the reviews and then get more specific as you're trying to figure out the nitty-gritty. And then as far as how I go through articles, if I'm deciding if they work or not, I typically start with the abstract, and then I look through subheadings of the introduction. And then sometimes I'll read like the last paragraph of the introduction to think about research aims and hypotheses. And if that's still looking good, then I kind of like skip down to the conclusion and read the conclusion. And then I'll read or skim the introduction where necessary if I'm unfamiliar with the content. And then finally, if I'm really diving deeply into that, I'll dive into the methods and results section, paying a lot of attention to tables and figures to figure out what they actually found. And so that's just my method for doing it, and I've seen that listed out in a couple other spaces when I was trying to figure this out. But I think my main takeaway is that you don't have to like read through every single article you come across in full. Okay. And so how to read article resources are here for you guys to use. And then the next sort of topic down the funnel is developing specific research ideas. So I think something that I personally wasn't quite aware of that I could just ask to do was asking to co-author or help out on projects you find interesting with people in your lab. And talking with your PI or graduate students about what could lead to a co-author role and what sort of things you could do to contribute to a project that could, one, help your publication record or help your poster record or what have you, but also give you a chance to really dive deeply into the research in that area to see if it's something that you want to sort of continue down the path on with regards to building your program of research. Um, and then sometimes I hear a lot that undergrads or postbacks are like, but what can I do? I'm not like super savvy with stats, or I didn't collect those things, or yada, yada, yada. But like there's so much to do with regards to like literature reviews or type editing or creating bibliographies, as well as just like how much richness there is in being involved in outlining meetings or meetings where you're shaping paper narratives and things. I think there's a lot that could be learned from just like asking to be in those spaces when those conversations are happening. Um, Also, most labs that people are in have a lot of pre-existing data sets, and there are also lots of public data sets. So if you're really itching to do your own work or your own paper, there's lots of unanalyzed questions often, and there's lots of unanalyzed parts of data sets that you could look up and work with. And so, I, as an undergrad, sort of started in that space by looking at like variable lists and thinking about like the bigger constructs that I was interested in, what's available, and what papers had already been written with those variables, trying to like sort of carve out your own niche of data that already exist. The last little tidbit is often PIs and labs have projects that they like wish could get done, but they don't have the bandwidth to do. So if you are just sort of unsure about creating your own question, but are like itching to help out, you could ask about that. And sometimes PIs are really excited to have somebody, being the driving force of moving something forward that they haven't quite had the time to make a huge specific focus. Okay. And so I'm kind of moving up a ladder of more and more independent. So if you feel that you want to do your own project and you want to collect your own data, my advice is to start really small and think about questionnaire based data collections, as well as doing small pilot projects to figure out what will or won't work. And yeah, so I think at that stage, that is where I would start, or how to add in your own parts to ongoing data projects that are already going on. So I know a lot of people that will add in like a questionnaire or a task to something that their graduate student mentor is already doing. Okay, so my biggest thing is to make sure you're talking about your goals here, and talking about people's interests and talking about those about research and about theory in all of these spaces. Like people want to hear from you, and that gives a lot of rich content for like letter writers and things like that. And I would say that if you're able to, going to local or national conferences are really great, important next steps. And there you can meet with or hear from people that are sort of doing, again, the cutting edge in the field, where they're also often talking about broad themes and ideas and sort of what they think the next steps for that line of research are. And you can figure out what those conferences are by talking to your principal investigators, instructors in classes, your peers, or graduate students in those labs. And I, as a graduate student, it wasn't until the last couple years that I started doing this, but like it is okay to cold email authors to ask them about questions you have about papers that you find interesting. Again, they might not always respond, but like often in those papers, they list emails for that very purpose. So if you had an outstanding question or wanted to hear more about something or talk through something that they said, it's okay to cold email authors about it. Okay. So the next thing down was creating that specific research question. And with that, I really liked this breakdown of thinking about describing and exploring, explaining and testing, or evaluating and acting, and the various research question formulations within that. And I think these are just like really nice examples of thinking through about just how specific you need to be with regards to variables and how they're related. My other caveats are that the research questions that you're asking don't need to be exactly what you want to be studying, as long as they're related or like helpful in that space. And they also do not need to be world shattering or crazy innovative. I think there's a lot of pressure that people put on themselves, even at beginning stages, to have these crazy innovative questions. And, you know, like replication is important, and like answering those questions even in slightly different dynamic ways are really great and solid contributions still. Okay, so I am almost through. So I'm gonna, so this piece is talking about pursuing poster and publication opportunities. My advice is to start with poster presentations, local or national conferences. Those are also great ways to get scholarships to go to those different conferences. And you can find out about those from your lab members or mentors. Often there are scholarships that help you with training, and a lot of PIs or mentors also have conference travel built into grants and things. And I touched on this before, but like definitely talk about co-authoring papers explicitly, or your interest in that. And some questions that I would ask are, what are lab requirements to be considered a co-author on publications? Does this ever happen for postdocs or undergraduates if you're considering joining a new lab? I think that's a really smart question to ask. And then if someone were interested in being a trailing author on a publication, how could they show their interest or get involved? And so these are all fair questions to ask, especially at the onset of joining lab spaces. Again, NextGen did a workshop on creating posters that I think is on the website, so you definitely check that out. And here are some additional resources on those pieces. And we are about to jump into personal examples, but I wanted to pause and ask if there were any questions, or if any of the panel members had anything come up or even disagreed with things I was highlighting. Oh, I see a hand raised. You can unmute if you'd like.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. Lots of good stuff. I have a question in general about how do you guys organize all of your papers? So I get like there's citation management places like Zotero and Mendeley, but like where do you keep like all your PDFs? Like, do you guys suggest like writing summaries? Because I feel like I have so many papers like important, 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 and they all get like lost. Yeah, do you guys have any advice on that?
I'm gonna let a panel member talk because I've been talking a lot.
I'm happy to. Oh, Sabrina, did you want to jump in?
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
I think probably multiple perspectives are going to be good for this one. So for me, I use a citation manager. I use Mendeley specifically, but there's also Zotero and EndNote. All three of those programs have the option of like appending PDFs to them, to the citations themselves. So that's typically what I do if I know it's something that I'm going to come back to for my research. If it's for class, I typically don't put it in the citation manager. But that's how I organize that initially so that I have it. And then every time that I'm working on proposing a paper or a project, I actually start out by outlining everything. And so I'll put everything that I read, I'll put like a little blurb of the important findings into like one Word document and start organizing the sections of the introduction from there. And then oftentimes, if I think I'm going to get rid of that draft, which I typically do multiple iterations of a draft that are dated, I will copy the little blurb into the notes section in the citation manager.
That helps. Thank you.
I'm with this same boat with Brian. I use Zotero and Mendeley. I find Zotero really easy to put the articles, as my research covers 3 kind of different areas. So I put folders, and each folder I put the articles, related articles. And I do another thing, I think, which really helps me. When I start writing an article, like a manuscript, because when you start writing a manuscript, definitely you start reading with some articles. And I make a draft document, like Word document. And when I read something, I just copy and paste that information from that article and put the comment that, okay, this is the DOI of that article. So that like after 3 months or 4 months, when I really start writing the article or manuscript, then it really helps me to get that information. So it happens for me when I write an article, maybe like there are 50 articles I get help. So I just put all the DOI or the name of the articles or the author's names with the years on the document file, Word file, and it helps me later a lot, especially when I was writing my comprehensive exam, because in Canada we have the comprehensive exam after 2 years. So this thing also helped me a lot. But for the citation, I think Mendeley is good. Zotero is easier for me. And I don't use the EndNote that much because personally, I don't like EndNote. People use EndNote a lot, especially to put the reference directly on the reference citations. But my supervisor, I think I learned it from him. He always uses very like manual process to write the references, because he thinks that like sometimes even EndNote, because it's a software-based program, so it makes mistakes sometimes as well. So even though it takes a lot of time from you, but still it's better to check every reference manually than if it's okay or not. So yeah.
Thank you. Makes sense.
I think everyone made really good points. I would say when I first started, again, I've been in a while, I would say when there were topics that were really, really what I was interested in, like, you know, what you apply to work in graduate school, I would say I started an Excel file, or you could do a Word document that just was like this paper and with its major findings that I found really, or whatever it was I found really interesting. And then I didn't use any kind of article citation manager. And then as I continued on in grad school, I switched to citation manager, mainly like I use Zotero mainly because I started remembering what those articles were about. So I didn't keep track in like an Excel file or a Microsoft Word document, like what these different papers were, because I'm writing about it actively. So I think whatever kind of works for you, if you need to just jot notes down on a Word doc that then has like the citation or the DOI or whatever it is, do that first, like as you're first starting. And then once you start writing about it, once you start working with that kind of, looking at that kind of material, it becomes a lot easier to remember these things.
Yeah, I agree with everything everyone said. I noticed that there was a question in the chat about utilizing secondary data where you're not involved in the data collection, and sort of getting an icky feeling about like feeling like you're fishing for questions. And, you know, as someone that has done a bit of secondary data analysis, I think my biggest advice there is to make sure that you're not looking at any of the data and that you're like comprehensively writing out what your conflicts of interest are, and doing a pretty thorough background review before even accessing the data or requesting access to those data. I think that helps a bit with regards to sort of keeping that a bit clean. And is the process that my lab had asked us to go through. But I see Bria has her hand up.
I agree with what you were saying, Alyssa. I also just wanted to add that some labs have a formal proposal process that helps combat against this. So even if they don't have that in your lab, you could always kind of create one that, you know, outlines your research questions. And if you really want to be transparent about it, the Open Science framework has templates for secondary data analysis that can guide you through pre-registering your research questions and hypotheses, so that you're really transparent about everything.
I think just to re-emphasize is like, generally speaking, even if like at the time my advisor didn't have the secondary data I wanted access to, I had a research question in mind and of something that I wanted to work on, but my advisor didn't have that kind of data. So I had the research question. I then went out into the world and found a secondary data source that could address either part, or in my case, all of it. But then obviously, as I started diving into the data, once I got access to it, I realized the certain scales I thought about using, or the certain, like, those kinds of things were not perfect. But in that sense, like, I made it work with that. So I think it's like whenever we have secondary data, it's always the case where it's like you come into it with the research question in mind, and then sometimes you have to adapt based off of whatever they have available. And that's, in my opinion, that is less fishing, because you already have a research question in mind. You're just tweaking it based off of the data itself. If you find yourself kind of going further than that, where you're not tweaking it, you're completely changing your question based off of the data that's available, then you want to stop, take a step back, re-look into that research question first before moving on. And then it will feel less like p-hacking or fishing around in the data for a significant effect.
All right. Any other questions popping up for people? Again, I know that these are really broad topics. And, as I'm thinking about these pieces too, I just want to also normalize that not everyone has a perfectly linear path with regards to all the research projects and labs that they're involved with, right? So a lot of this is me encouraging you guys to be thoughtful about those pieces, but very, very, very often, and it's very common to have to, like, sort of in retrospect, when you're sitting down to like write a fellowship application or write a job application or a postdoc application, to need to like tie together these pieces that maybe at the time you weren't being super thoughtful about, or you weren't as clear to how these things were connected. And I don't know, I just want to sort of normalize that process, because I'll walk through my example here in a moment, but I did take a couple deviating paths right at the beginning that like felt like they were hard to tie in. Well, we'll have more time for questions at the end, but I think I'm up first here, so I can talk through mine. So I sort of listed all of these things in blue up here as all of the various experiences that I've had that I think have really shaped the development of my research program. And so all the way back to undergrad research assistant days, working with secondary data projects, writing with all of my mentors, eventually collecting some of my own data. As a clinical student, getting some clinical experience has also informed sort of my interest and passion. And then also classes and training grants. So I was on an NMI, National Institute of Mental Health training grant as a pre-doc. And I think a lot of the things that they sort of asked us to read or take part in helped me really think more deeply about my research program and things that I wanted to study moving forward. So looking for opportunities in these spaces can help you answer that question of what you want that research program to look like. And so my path, I actually started off in a linguistics lab where we were working with mono and bilingual individuals and thinking about differences in neurological functioning and executive functioning, specifically based off of if you're bilingual or monolingual and when you gained that second language. It was not my cup of tea. I found it incredibly boring. We were doing a bunch of really, really rigid cognitive testing and these like really black boxes in the basement of a building. And then, I originally signed up because I was like, cool, we get to do MRI stuff. And then I quickly realized that as an undergrad, all I was able to do at that lab was take them through like the fake fMRI. And then like the real one happened later. So I like talked them through that piece. And it just was like boring me to tears. And I left that lab after my single semester commitment, and actually joined a lab that focused on some littles and mostly focused in on temperament, and sort of this idea of precursors to the development of anxiety. I really liked it, but it felt to me like we were studying a lot of individuals in like middle and upper income spaces. And as someone from a well, maybe I should back up and say that as I was reading about temperament stuff, and writing with my mentor and thinking about secondary data projects for my I had to do a thesis project in undergrad, I was recognizing that temperament and emotion regulation were really, really related. And these constructs were really intertwined, and asking questions about that. And I was encouraged by my undergrad mentor to think about these pieces. And I realized that I like found the construct of emotion regulation a little bit more amenable to my interests, especially with regards to like environmental impacts. And when I was here, I was thinking about the fact that all of the secondary data and writing I was doing in undergrad was with these like weird samples, so mostly white and middle income. And as someone coming from a lower income background and really caring about risk and taking classes in these spaces, I realized that I was really interested in how these things intersected. And so I went to graduate school, and worked with Ann Maston, who studies risk and resilience, as well as Dan Barry, who does stress physiology. And both of them think a lot about emotion regulation in early childhood. So I'm like thinking about these capacities. And as I'm thinking about what helps young kids develop emotion regulation skills, especially in context of stress, I learned a lot about parenting. And so we're like sort of walking down these lines of my like causal mechanism process. And then while I was thinking about parenting, I started doing a training grant, and I started taking some more complex research methods classes, and started thinking more broadly about theory. And I care a lot about emotion regulation development in these risky contexts. So I wanted to really think about what are multi-system resilience factors in early childhood that promote emotion regulation. So we sort of walked along this line. And finally, this last picture over here is a picture of my dissertation sort of conceptual model, where I'm thinking a lot about kid social and emotional development and how their emotion regulation skills and parenting, and their parent systems that support their parenting are helping kiddo develop over time. So like being able to sort of build on these systems, and with my dissertation utilizing secondary data because I wanted to answer complex questions, and that would be really hard for me to collect thousands of data points or thousands of points of data longitudinally as a grad student at this point, to answer those big questions. So I found a secondary data source to do that with. Yeah, I feel like that's a nice sum up of my piece. And I think Sabrina is next.
Okay, thank you, Alyssa. For me, actually, my research interest, it started during my undergrad, because I got the psychology as my major discipline, because I always wanted to study human behavior and the practical aspect of this discipline. So that's why for my master's thesis, I did my research project with the children with who are developmentally delayed, the delayed population. And following that, I thought that, okay, if I pursue my career in research, I really want to do the research with children, and definitely the children who have the developmental issues. So eventually, when I started my PhD at McGill, so in my lab, before coming here, I didn't know that, but the first day I entered my lab, I figured out that I was the first PhD student of this lab. So that was cool, but at the same time, that was really challenging for me, because, you know, if you're in an established lab, definitely you have some senior lab mates, some colleagues who will help you to navigate your way, give some insights. But for me, it was really different, a unique journey, I would say. So my supervisor, he's expert in math cognition, and he really wants to do research with the educational technology. But for me, I always wanted to do research with the developmentally delayed children. So that's what the I wouldn't say it's conflict of interest, but our interest was kind of different, both of our interests. So what I did, I wanted to negotiate with his interest to my interest, and I asked him that, okay, I'm going to do research with the math cognition, but I will be really focusing on the children and the children who have difficulties with math. So that's how my research started, like my research topic started, but it was very broad at the very beginning. So when I found my specific research interest for my PhD, okay, I'm going to do research on math cognition and with children. And my supervisor, he told me that, Sabrina, it's better if you integrate educational technology on this thing. But I was thinking how to integrate the educational technology with math cognition, children's math cognition. So that's why I had to read a lot of articles. I still remember on my first 2 years, PhD 2 years, I read almost 176 articles, if I remember, and specifically in 3 specific fields: educational technology, math cognition, and children with mathematical learning disabilities. And then eventually I came up with my research idea, because I found out that, okay, there are lots of research happening in this area, but there is a very specific research gap in this area. And on that time, I'd say Twitter helped me a lot, because I started using Twitter and I got to know researchers from this field. So I could understand that, okay, these people are doing this research, that people are doing this research. So I thought that, okay, let's find my research questions, research objectives and research questions. So it took a while for me to get my research objectives and research questions. I had like every 2 weeks, I had like almost 2 to 3 hours meeting with my supervisor, because he gave me some suggestions. I gave him some suggestions. And he always wanted to focus on the educational technology perspective. And that time it was really difficult for me, because he suggested me that I can use some kind of math app as an intervention tool for the children who have the math difficulties. But when I searched for the Apple App Store and Google Play Store, I didn't find a very specific kind of app which specifically focus on that perspective, a very specific perspective of numeration. So, and then, when you have a very difficult thing, you always find your way. So what I started contacting with app developer company by myself. And I emailed to them, I searched on the Google, Twitter. So that's how eventually I contacted with an app developer company. And I took the initiative to have a meeting with them, because I really wanted to make an app which will serve the children who has the math learning disabilities. Or math difficulties. So we had the meeting, and the meeting was really successful, because they really wanted to work with us. And I proposed my idea to my supervisor, and he said that would be really great. But here comes another issue, the money issue, the funding or grant issue. That's another thing. As a PhD student, we have to really think about it. But my supervisor, he really helped me a lot on that perspective. He gave some money to the app developers, because I don't have any idea about the programming thing, about the designing thing, like the background thing of an app. But they have this. They're the expert on these things. So what I did, I gave them the design. I gave them the every specs, like how to develop an app. I just told them, and they just made it. So that's how I ended up developing an app. So that's how my the initial stage of my research started. And then as my supervisor, I was the first student of him. So he wanted to explore as well. So he came up with international collaboration with another university in Hong Kong. And he wanted me to collaborate with them to make my study as cross-cultural study. So I found this opportunity really good for me, because I thought it will give me benefit, but it became difficult, because when you collaborate with some other people. They will have their own term, they will have their own interest, you will have your own interest. So it will take time to have a common ground. And we started sharing materials between ourselves, and I ended up having a lot of material for the data collection. So that's another challenge I had to face, because when we applied for the research ethics approval, they said that it will be overwhelming for the children in terms of their cognitive load, because we were using more than 10 measurement for them. And the targeted group was from grade 1 to grade 5. So, and then we had to exclude some materials. And our initial target was to have 200 kids and 200 parents. But you know, I'm trying to say you the practical aspect of data collection. When you design, when I reflect back to this experience, now I can understand what could I do to make this journey easier for me, because I had to navigate everything by myself. So it's 200 kids, and that collection should be on the school based. And my supervisor, he said that he can't fund me to go for that collection. I have to get volunteer RS for the project, and I have to train by myself. And if someone is interested to collect the data with me, then definitely they can serve as an RA, but we can't pay them. So what I did, I made some posters and got some like almost 20 RS for my data collection. And I told them that, okay, if you work on this project, definitely I'm gonna give you a very good recommendation. Not only me, you're gonna get recommendation from my supervisor as well, because he's the PI of this lab. And that's how I ended up having almost 20 RS, and I trained them. Like for a whole semester, I trained them, because the data collection process was really intense. And then we collected the data. So what I'm trying to say about my experience is that for your PhD research program development, I think it's better to make it simpler and specific. So because I ended up having a lot of stuff, I have collaborated with an industry, I have collaborated with an academic institution, I got a lot of data. But now it's good, because for my thesis, I have to have 3 papers, like 3 manuscripts, but I have a lot of data. With those data, I can publish at least 3 or more articles more, because I have a lot of data. So that's the positive thing for me, but it was really overwhelming. So for PhD, it's better to try to make a very specific portion of the study, because at the beginning, when we start our PhD, we think like that, okay, I'm gonna change this field, I'm gonna make a very unique thing on this specific field of research, but the reality is not like that. If you study on a very specific thing, definitely this specific thing you can build it as your PhD study. So I would suggest that try to start with a simple thing, with a small thing, and then try to build it up. For me, I had to come backward. Like I started with lots of things, and then I had to like shrink it. But I would suggest that try the different way. Start with a small thing and try to build it up. So that's what my journey. But at the very end, this journey gave me a very good skills, because I could collaborate with people as PhD students. So it will give me a very good experience for my future skills. And I could train RS. So if I can establish a lab in future as a PI, if I'm in academia, definitely this experience will help me as well. And then I had to do, because I was the first PhD student of this lab, I had the lab management experience, and I worked with some other side projects as well. These experiences will give me lots of skills. And then I had the data analysis skills experience, because I had to work on these like 200 kids data, parents data, and other site study project data as well. And another thing I would really focus on, try to reach the academic community, because community outreach is really important. It's important that, okay, you're going to have your article published, you're going to present on your conference, but in terms of your leadership skill, organizational skill, it will help you to develop your CV a lot. So try to connect with people outside of your lab. It's really important. And outside of your university, it's really important as well. And if it's possible, try to broaden your zone, like try to make it broader, so that at the very end, when you reflect back or when you write your CV, then you'll understand that, okay, you're gonna have a very good profile for your future career. So yeah, that's what I was trying to say. Does anyone have any question about my research development or? Okay. And yeah, I gave some examples of my materials preparation to give an overlook. So it's just nothing, but it had a lot of things over there. So yeah. So I think the next presenter is Brian.
Hello. Yes. So I am not very good at creating these little slides, so I'm sorry. But I started out in undergrad in a lab that focused on adolescents, primarily adolescents from diverse backgrounds and marginalized backgrounds. And I started thinking about, what I was interested in, and I'm a first generation college student, a member of the LGBTQ community, and have faced some difficulties in the past. And so I was also very drawn to adversity research. But I didn't stay there. So being first gen, I had to work full time throughout my entire undergrad career. So I started out as a delivery driver for a good portion of my undergrad. And then I was able to get an RA-ship a paid RA-ship in the lab that I was in that was doing this adversity research. And then I was also able to get a part-time RA-ship in a driving and injury prevention lab. And that got me up to like full-time hours. And so I don't cover as much about the driving and injury prevention lab here because that was never really my substantive area of interest. But it was valuable in terms of keeping me housed during undergrad and teaching me a lot of valuable things. But I was very, very new to research. I had already had my associates and was well on my way to finishing my bachelor's when I kind of discovered what research in psychology was. So I knew I was interested in adversity, but I really wasn't sure what. And so I racked my brain for a really long time. I needed to also write an honors thesis. And kind of found a gap with community violence exposure and coping and how those interact to influence outcomes. And so that's what I did my honors thesis on. And I extended that to both internalizing and externalizing outcomes. At the University of Minnesota in graduate school, I work with Janin Karatikin, who does adversity research more broadly. So I thought that it was important to become familiar with kind of that domain and area as a whole. I know there's a lot of arguments in terms of lumpers and splitters, whether or not you should be looking at just one type of adversity versus looking at the cumulative effects. So I wanted to become well-versed in that area as well. But at the heart of it, I still do a lot of community violence exposure, neighborhood environment type of research. And I also became interested in physiological health outcomes. So I also work with Megan Gunner and primarily looking at biomarkers of allostatic load like cortisol for that. So largely before graduate school and in my first year of graduate school, I was really in this space of linking adversity or community violence specifically to various outcomes. And through a collaboration with Janin, who's my primary advisor, and someone in the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota, a pediatrician over in the medical school, I worked on a scoping review of over 1,300 articles of the last 20 years of publishing on adverse childhood experiences, which really kind of solidified, I think, my program of research and how I wanted to build it. I'm not as far into my education as some of the other people on this call, so I hope that this kind of gives you an idea of like how to maybe get started. But as we were working on that, we looked at the World Health Organization's framework on social determinants of health. And we decided to, I know this figure is very small, but we decided to kind of break down the pieces of research designs for these 1,300 articles, whether or not they were predictors, moderators, mediators, and then also where they fell within this framework. So if someone was looking at associations between race and adverse childhood experiences, then we would code race as a structural determinant of health, and we would code adverse childhood experiences as an intermediary determinant of health. So we really mapped the entire literature onto that framework, and found that, like I had started out doing, a lot of people were linking this intermediary determinant level to health outcomes. And I think that's a really great avenue. I'm still very interested in that avenue, but this really expanded my thinking towards more upstream factors. So this framework suggests that the socioeconomic and political context gives rise to inequities at these structural levels, and stratifies people according to social class, gender, ethnicity, education, occupation, income. And then that stratification of individuals and those inequities lead to these intermediary determinants of health. So these poor material circumstances, stressors, different psychosocial factors, which then leads to these health outcomes. And so I really started to expand my thinking to wanting to look at both sides of the coin. So not only looking at the downstream effects of community violence exposure, but also some of the upstream and root causes. And so I started thinking more about policy as well. And so that's kind of where things are right now. And I realized if I wanted to move into this, upstream sphere, I really needed some more experience. So I also work with the Minnesota Population Center, which is at the University of Minnesota. And I am in their population studies training program. And I have started working with epidemiologists and community health specialists and sociologists to gain a better understanding of some of these structural determinants of health. So my work has become very interdisciplinary and quite collaborative. I've started working with people at 4 different institutions across the country. And I kind of, in all of that and like dabbling in all of these areas, I currently work with 4 people between my actual funding RA-ships and the people I work with in my home department, which is a lot to manage when you're like trying to build a program of research and something thematic. And so I kind of make sure that everything that I'm doing kind of serves this broader goal and kind of fits within this framework. So that's currently how I'm framing things and thinking about things.
Okay, so I guess I'm the last one, and I will enjoy telling you that you can make a program of research out of a bunch of uh, maybe not as related topics. So my pathway was very kind of all over the place. And sometimes what I would say is very early on, sometimes you might not see how these different projects fit together. But then when you actually take the time later on, like as you become, you know, fourth, fifth year postdoc, like these things, the connections that you can make start to become a lot more clear. So don't be afraid. I guess also just saying, like, don't be afraid to say no to a collaboration or those kinds of things. You know, everyone's pathway is different. Some people have extremely streamlined projects where everything is very much consistent across the board in terms of the topics of paper. Like when you look at CVs, like the papers they write, other people kind of dabble, or dabble is not the greatest word, but kind of have a larger, like, broader conceptual model or thought of like their larger research questions, and they pick at little pieces here and there. So basically, when I first started in my undergrad, what I thought I wanted to do was family influences on adolescent delinquency. That is not where I am. That is not what really happened. So here down below, what really happened is I actually started looking at heritable, prenatal, and family environmental influences on children's development of social competence, both in preschool and in adolescence. So looking at the more positive outcomes versus the negative, and also broadening my scope or interest in kind of risk factors and protective factors. So I definitely did not start with a postbac or anything, so don't feel like you need that necessarily. It can definitely help you if you want to get more experience. I always think it's good to get more experience if you can get it. I started out actually at a master's because I needed that experience. My undergrad, it was a small liberal arts college, so my undergrad really didn't have those experiences available to me. So my master's, I was involved in basically two different labs. One looking at basically a prenatal stress intervention program, and another project that was basically looking at ADHD behaviors, aggression, and executive functioning in college students. So very different in terms of what I was exposed to. And then I went to my PhD program, and to be 100%, I wrote my graduate applications about mostly family environmental influences on adolescent and child development. And there was a few people, like I was interested in genetics, but you know, there were only so many people who do genetic research. So for those those PIs, I talked about genetics. For the others, I didn't so much. But basically, I got into my PhD program, and I basically focused on working with my advisor the first couple of years. And in that period of time, I really focused on kind of the genetics and family environment on adolescent outcomes and behavior. I got involved in a secondary lab at Penn State. In developmental psych, you do a secondary lab. It's pretty common, I think, in a lot of programs, but in that secondary lab, I really got involved in understanding more about family processes. So but you know, that lab didn't have genetic research. So it was kind of like my interests, my projects were kind of diverging, where one was looking at family and genetics, the other was looking at just family without genetics. And then I became a project coordinator for twin data collection project. And I mean, that fits in with what I was kind of interested in with looking at genetics and family. I also got involved in a IES training grant. I would like to say that I'm interdisciplinary. So I worked with education people, researchers, and a huge thing I can't speak of more highly enough is collaborate with other students in your program. Find the common links with other students, especially older students, 100%. Don't wait for them to come to you. Go to them and say, hey, I have this project I'm thinking about. Can you help me with it? So ask these older students to help you, because one, you aren't relying on them to put you on their projects. You're instead being like, hey, help me. And then maybe in kind, they will then include you and you can build that relationship with them. So collaborate with other students. With other students, I started, working on papers that were looking at the child role in teacher and parent-child relationships. And it kind of then sparked my interest, moving beyond just these kind of, even though we consider them proximal as parenting, but they're more distal from the child, right? So they're more removed from the child. There are risk factors that influence child development. But then I became more interested, based off these collaborations, in the role of child temperament, reactivity, and regulation on their own development, and kind of melding all of these things together. And honestly, it ended in my dissertation, which is this lovely diagram that you see right here. This is actually my dissertation. So it's basically piecing together all of these different components. So it was my interest in, genetic influences and prenatal and parenting and child. Obviously, in what I would say you might be asking in all of this is like, where's the prenatal? I also am not the greatest at making these cute diagrams, but the prenatal components were oftentimes, until I got to my dissertation, I felt like my research on the prenatal influences were kind of like a weird side project. So I wrote a paper or two where it was like focusing on prenatal influences, but it really didn't click that it was any way connected. And so it really wasn't until I got to my dissertation phase where I really was starting to like piece all of these components together and really thinking about it. And so I think, and also moving forward, like as I said in my postdoc, this F32 is a grant that I applied for in my graduate program. And now I'm focusing a lot more on the prenatal influences. So kind of adding more of that research back into like what it is that I do. And so what I would say to you is sometimes, especially early on, you might not think everything fits. And I think it's really important, if your program requires it of you, writing a research statement at the end of every year can be really helpful for you trying to figure out how everything ties together, right? So you think about it, some people write it linearly, where they're like, I was interested in this, and then I got into this, and then I got into this, and then I got into this. And that reads really well. Other people, you'll start to learn that you can't necessarily show a linear pattern. And that's okay, because to be honest, when you start writing grants don't always care about a linear pattern. They're going to ask you, like NIH, for example, NIH isn't going to ask you like, what is your research, what was your research statement, or what's your research plan? They're going to instead ask, what are the major topics that you have major contributions in? And so you kind of have to boil your research into, instead of this linear trajectory, boil your research into these different components where it's like genetics and family, child, prenatal. And so it's completely okay to kind of have multiple projects that maybe are tackling different components, as long as you can see and make connections. And sometimes those connections, you won't be able to see them yourself. And I would highly advise, I think it's really important to always be having these conversations with your PI and others about like, how does this work? Especially like if you're working with faculty, like on multiple different faculty on different projects, it's always great to get their opinion. How do you see this fitting into my work? Like have those like professional development conversations, because they're there to help you. Like with my training grant, I actually had a committee like outside of my dissertation committee that was basically, their job was to help me be better, like help me with my academic planning and thinking. And so every year we had the same question: how did the projects you were working on fit into your whole research program? And so I think having those conversations at any level, at any time, very young, like, when you first start out in grad school, or as you're thinking about going to grad school, it's okay when you're like, I really want, like how I was, like, I wanted to do this. It's completely okay. You'll start to see things shifting and changing. You don't have to stick, like, if I wanted, like, if when I came in, I wanted to do this, if I had stuck with that, I wouldn't have had all the opportunities that I did have. And so, yes, it could look like my CV in comparison to others is less streamlined and it could potentially look less focused, right? As you read the different titles. But that's the whole point of having a research statement, is it shows that progression and you making those connections. And I always say people too is like, how Alyssa, Bria, and Sabrina, like we all showed you these diagrams. It's never too early to start diagramming for yourself as you move on through the years, because these diagrams can be extremely helpful. Every single time you present it to someone, connections become more clear for you. So I think it's like having those continually having those conversations. In the case of Sabrina, like she had to go out there and collect her own data. Like that can happen, and it happens. It's always more challenging, and but you get a lot more out of it, or you get different experiences out of it. So I think, keeping that in mind, like you guys, if you're moving into grad school, you're about to think about that, like, programs of research, like it's a huge topic. And I think, those kinds of things are good to have in the back of your mind, to kind of think about where you want to go, think about, some people say is like, project out 5 years from now. Where do you want to be 5 years from now? And like that, and thinking of that way would be like your program of research. Like, what do you want to leave grad school saying, like, this is what I do? And it's okay, both pathways, linear or non-linear, are okay, as long as you explain it and people understand, and constantly explain it. Like the elevator speech never goes away. It never, like it's always there, especially in academic circles. That will always be there. It'll never go away. So constantly having to practice that, I think, is also can be really helpful, and like making sure that your program of research and your understanding of your program of research is clear to everyone. That's all I have.
Thanks so much, guys. I think it's so helpful, even for me to hear through these pieces, and also to hear that, like, it's okay for things to develop. Like, it doesn't have to be exactly where you thought you would be, right? Like, different opportunities come up, and you figure out as you learn more what you're more passionate about, or what pathways you're going down. We have, I think, about 13 minutes before we're supposed to end. So we have a little bit of time for any additional questions for any panel members about their specific journeys, or anything that's been percolating since we finished sort of the general presentation. It's also okay if people don't have any questions, but maybe give you guys a couple minutes. You can also type them if you don't want to speak.
Hi, everyone. That was really helpful. Thank you so much. I joined late because I was in another meeting, so I might have missed this, but I guess I'm wondering if there were a template of sorts to help fill out. I know everybody's kind of journey will look different, but if there's a template available, and or maybe if these slides would be available in some sense to go back and reference as we build our own charts.
Yeah, I will send out a link to where these are on the drive for people to access, with also with the recording, so you can go back and watch the beginning if you'd like or not. It doesn't matter. As far as template, are you sort of thinking template with regards to like graphing out pieces?
Yeah, I guess so. I know that everyone's journey will look really different, but I like that multiple of your slides have kind of mapped like events or times in your career along with interests and how those have kind of gone hand in hand with those phases of your career. So I don't know. I don't know exactly what that would look like. Maybe that's too individualized. But thanks. I'm glad that the slides will be available so we can go back and reference.
I think that one way that could be helpful for you or anyone really is in PowerPoint, they have that where it's like the smart art and they have that like timeline option where it adds the little bullets. I really think for a lot of people like that kind of like timeline feature can be really helpful. And any kind of like those smart art things, like they're genius. Like I've seen lots of job talks where they use basically those timeline smart arts to kind of show their different like like their different like kind of forks in the road or whatever, what have you. And I think that could be a really good place to start, is just like timelining it out so you can keep it fresh in your mind of like, I made a fork in the road right here and I went this way and I went that way. That could be a good start. Or Venn diagrams of like major topics could be helpful.